Immigration has long been a key part of Canada's ethos. And for many years, Canada's immigration system was held up and lauded as the global standard. And governments enjoyed firm public support. For decades, Canadians have been pro-immigration, citing its benefits for the economy, but also its contributions to the rich tapestry of language, culture, and tradition. However, as Canadians navigate the rising cost of living, housing affordability, and access to public services, many, well, 2/3 in fact, believe that Canada's targets to welcome 1.5 million newcomers to the country over the next 3 years is a little, well, or a lot off the mark. And the public support for immigration, well, it's a little less than firm. So how did we get here? Hi there. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this episode of The Brief, I am joined by a special co-host, my wonderful colleague and friend, Alicia Planinchich, who is not only a brilliant economist, but has been leading the research and policy work on the Business Council of Alberta's project to understand what a prosperity-driven immigration strategy might look like for Canada.
Today, we're joined by Dr. Mikal Skuterud, a labor economist from the University of Waterloo and the director at the Canadian Labour Economic Forum, to tackle an issue that, for many decades, evaded the sights and minds of reporters and news editors and the public, but now finds itself smack in the middle of nearly every major public headline of the past year. We're talking immigration, how Canada's system works, and how it doesn't. First, let's cover a little background, and for the data and policy wonks out there, a little statistics. In 2022, Canada experienced record numbers of population growth and is well on its way to breaking those records yet again. With the federal government's new targets, immigration will account for nearly all of Canada's population growth and all of the workforce growth between now and 2036. That means that almost 30% of the population and 37% of the workforce will be immigrants.
Now, there's almost always been a clear link between immigration and economic growth. More people equals a bigger pie. But, as Mikal notes, when your population grows faster than the capital stock to support it, you run into problems. Bigger pie, but smaller slices for everyone. And side note, when we're talking about capital stock, we're talking about housing, healthcare services, public transportation, technology, offices, computers, machines, schools, and everything else that allows us to produce what we use to live, work, and play. So here's what Mikal had to say about immigration and capital investment.
The effect of immigration on the housing market is not any different from the effect of immigration on other capital markets. You know, the way economists think about housing is just another part of the country's capital stock. And the way I think about capital is it's essentially all the stuff in the economy that allows us to be productive, that allows us to produce. So how does housing contribute to us being productive? Well, it allows us to sleep at night, to get a good rest. You know, wake up in the morning, be refreshed, go to a workplace. You know, if we're sleeping out on the street, that's going to affect our labor productivity during the day. So it's a huge part of kind of the productive capacity of an economy is the housing stock. But of course, capital is much more than housing. It's all kind of machinery and equipment and technology. It's offices, it's factories, it's the healthcare system, it's the public transportation systems, it's the schools we send our kids to. That's all the stuff that allows them to be productive, and it's a huge determinant of whether a country is a rich country or poor country. It's just how much capital we all have on average. And the challenge is, of course, quite simple, that when the population of a country is growing at a faster rate than the capital stock is growing at, then we get something called capital dilution, and it means there's less capital per worker, and on average, that will tend to lower labor productivity. And so there's just no question that that is, to some extent, playing out. You know, Canada has this long historical problems, issues with labor productivity. So there's certainly, you know, immigration is not the reason for Canada's labor productivity problems. There's no question that there's bigger challenges here. Absolutely no question. But I think the issue is that we were struggling with capital investment before 2015 when we started to ramp up. You know, the environment we had in 2015 when we started to focus on increasing immigration rights, is that the right policy? And I would say an environment in which there isn't a lot of capital investment. That's not the right policy to lean on an increase in population. That's just going to exacerbate existing problems.
For sure. The thing I always think about when I think about capital dilution is I was teacher as well for a few years, and it's like you can add a few students up to a point in a classroom, but before not, you need another classroom,
another
teachers, you need another school. And so I think those are the things we're starting to talk about. I'm starting to hear people think about a little bit more, but it feels like we haven't a whole lot to date. To economists, policymakers, and business leaders, Canada's productivity challenges are well known, and we need to think about improving our productivity far beyond simply increasing immigration targets. Because at the end of the day, it's not really about the numbers. It's about a strategy that works for Canada and for newcomers. And that strategy, according to the BCA's When More Isn't Enough paper, and to Mikal, needs to start with attracting, selecting, and retaining skills to build our human capital.
So, as I've been saying a lot lately, that this narrative around the potential for increased immigration or immigration in general to boost economic growth rates, that exists. In theory, it exists. And I would say that if you look at the U.S., there's pretty good empirical evidence that potential exists. The U.S. is exceptional at leveraging immigration to raise economic growth. So how does that happen? What's sort of the channel or the mechanism through which that happens? There is no question that the greatest potential is to try and attract and select and retain skills, what economists call human capital, to try and raise the average human capital in the population. Why does human capital raise economic growth? Well, more skilled workers are going to be more productive. Their marginal productivity, as economists say, will tend to be higher. But there's something else that happens, and that is the productivity of labor increases. But there's kind of another mechanism that runs through another factor called total factor productivity. It allows all the inputs into the production process to somehow be more productive. And that happens through kind of the contribution of human capital to innovation, to the creation of new ideas and new knowledge. New production processes are designed. All this kind of allows the whole production process, not just labor productivity, but the whole production process to become more productive. And so that is the kind of the mechanism, is to try and select and retain immigrants that are going to serve to raise the average human capital of the population. And so, the U.S. is exceptional at doing that because they have some magnet universities that attract the creme de la creme from all over the world, and employers can poach talent from those top schools. And so if you look at outcomes like earnings of immigrants in the U.S., it's just off the charts. Like Indian-born workers in the U.S. with university degrees do unbelievably well. They're outperforming American-born workers with the university degrees, right? They're just like the absolute top talent. Canada has historically struggled on this front. It doesn't mean there isn't a potential there, but it is a challenge for Canada.
The unfortunate reality is that Canada is not winning the race here.
The U.S. is exceptional because of two factors. One is the universities, the students they're able to attract. The other thing, though, is, of course, that this is an uncomfortable kind of reality, that if you have a more unequal earnings distribution, what it means is that people at the very bottom end of the earnings distribution are going to do worse if things are more unequal. But people at the very top end of the distribution will tend to do better. And so we know that it's very clear in the data that the U.S. returns to skill in the U.S. are higher than in Canada. There's bigger gaps between high and low skilled workers in their earnings. If you're a very talented, very gifted, exceptional skill in whatever profession or occupation you work in, most people know that you're going to earn more money in the U.S. I mean, this isn't news to Canadians. Canadians have observed a brain drain of talent from Canada to the U.S. within economics. My PhD supervisor left to go to the U.S. for a higher salary, and he was very clear. It was the salary that motivated him. During my PhD, he disappeared. The recent Nobel Prize winner in economics, David Card, is born in Guelph, Ontario. There's more than David Card. There are lots of wonderful economists working in the U.S. It's harder to find really high-quality American-born economists working in Canada. So that's just a reality. They're drawn by those really high earnings. And so that is part of the challenge for Canada. That absolutely doesn't mean that, the right policy prescription is that we need more inequality in Canada. That's it just means that there's a challenge there that we need to overcome.
So why is Canada not winning the race? Well, as Mikal notes, we might not be selecting economic immigrants in a way that enables Canada to reach its fullest potential.
To make it as simple as possible, we've always got to remember that Canada's immigration system has multiple objectives, and economic objectives is only one of them. And I've actually tend to be someone who believes that we tend to actually overemphasize the economic objectives, and we don't talk enough about some of the other objectives. Everything becomes about the economy, and I'm an economist, and I say that. But if we take as given that we're focused on the part of the program that's about trying to achieve economic objectives, that is sort of raise average living standards in the overall population, including the population that includes the new immigrants, then we're pretty sure what we've got to do is attract and retain select immigrants who are going to raise average human capital in the population. How do you do that? Well, I would say it's not that simple. Like universities and what they're doing is not that different. Universities are trying to attract talent into their classes, into their programs. How do they do that? Well, they first create some programs where they say, here's a minimum standard. For you to enter this program in computer science or economics, here's the minimum standard. So in immigration, using the analogy, we have the same thing. So there's a certain number of programs. We have provincial nominee programs. We have a federal skilled worker program. Those are like the minimum standards. Those programs say, here's what you need, but if you don't meet these standards, don't even bother applying. But if you meet these standards, then send us an application and we'll put you in the applicant pool. Just like a university. If you have the minimum high school grade point average, then you're going to qualify for this program. Send us your application. We'll consider it. In the immigration side, the applicant pool has a name. It's called the express entry pool. You get put into that express entry pool. And unlike a university that selects from the pool every year, the immigration department in Canada selects from the express entry pool about every 2 weeks. How do they select from the pool? Not that different from a university. Rather than using a high school grade point average, they use something called the comprehensive ranking system. The comprehensive ranking system basically is a prediction of immigrants' future labor market earnings in Canada. How successful will they be? Well, how do they predict that? Well, they look historically at how have previous immigrants with similar characteristics performed in Canada. Now, that model and what information is being used to feed that prediction is really important for how well you select. And that model was created in 2015 and has never really been changed very much, hasn't been enhanced. But of course, the factors that predict success are going to be constantly changing. They're not static, they're constantly evolving. So that prediction model is something you want to kind of constantly change. But once you create that score, the comprehensive ranking system score, then every 2 weeks the immigration department just goes in and says, well, this is how many people we're going to select. So we just cream skim the applicant pool based on this score, just like a university would pick the applicants with the highest high school grade. So what would I do to improve selection? Well, I think that system for constructing the grades, right? Just like a high school constructing grades for students, they evaluate how good is this student. We give them grades. We've got to do that for the immigrant applicants. We've got to give them grades. And I think there's a lot of information that we could be using to predict grades that we don't. Two very important ones are right now, increasing proportion of the immigrants in the applicant pool are in Canada and working. So we know what their earnings are. We know what their occupation is. We don't use any of that information in predicting, which is kind of crazy, but we don't. We also don't use any information about their field of study or even what university we went to. No, it's not very popular to go around pointing out the fact that not all universities or colleges in Canada are equal quality. But, a credential from University X is not always the same quality or as good of a predictor as future outcomes as a degree from University Y. Why not use that information to predict who's going to be more successful, who the higher quality candidates are?
One of the core challenges with Canada's economic immigration selection process, as Mikal notes, is that it's often not responsive to the changes in the labor market needs and doesn't always consider the best indicators of future success, like future earnings.
I love your point about continually reassessing, refining, improving, and that things will change over time. I feel like that's not a point that's commonly raised when we talk about the CRS or changing it. Something that's kind of top of mind for me is even just the amount of new information that we have that we didn't before in terms of, labor market information and all these things. And it's changing all the time, and our understanding is changing all the time. So I love that you brought that up.
Given that there is so much that changes just in the economy from, year to year, decade to decade, like what does that maybe review process look like to make sure that our grading system does actually match what is happening external in the economy, that match a little bit more?
I love that term, a grading system. I have never thought of it but that's what it is. It's a grading system. That's exactly what it is. And so we've got to reevaluate our rubric for grading. And how do we do that? Well, I was part of some of the consultation when it was done in 2014. The express entry system started in January 2015, but the analysis of the data to inform what the CRS points should be, what the criteria and the weights should be, was constructed in 2014. These are essentially, for anybody who's done kind of an economics degree or any social science degree, you know what a regression analysis is. Regression is that it's a statistical analysis where you have some outcome, in this case, immigrants' earnings in some point in the future or over the next 10 years after they land in Canada. And then you have on the right-hand side of this equation all these predictors. What is their education? How much work experience do they have? What's their age? What are their language skills? We can assess those. All these predictors. And what we do is we sort of predict what's the relative value of all these predictors in predicting their earnings. How do they translate into higher earnings? What's their relative worth? And once we estimate that model, then we can sort of take any immigrant who's in the applicant pool and feed in their information and spit out a predicted earnings. But that equation and the kind of the weights and the criteria, that's something that could very easily, IRCC, once they build a model, could say, we're going to re-estimate this every 6 months or every year. I mean, once a year. We re-estimate the model once a year. We re-evaluate it. I mean, this is not that complicated. This is a team of 3 or 4 people that are responsible for this, nothing more than that. This is standard techniques. And they reevaluate it every year, and they adjust those weights. The beauty of the system, I'll tell you the biggest beauty of the system is that it's kind of like Moneyball, the movie Moneyball. It's not politicized. It's not going with gut feelings. It's tying politicians' hands and saying, let's let the data do the talking. Let's let the data do the talking of where these workers are needed, where there's demand, where wages are high, where outcomes are high. Let's constantly evaluate this thing. And I think that's a much better way of doing it for 2 main reasons. One, it doesn't politicize immigration. Ideally, you want immigration policy out of the headlines in the newspapers. This is like a little train you want chugging along in the background. You don't want it being noticed. So that's the one thing. You don't want to politicize it. You want it in the background. But the other really wonderful thing about the CRS is once the model is there and you're predicting people's scores, it's very transparent. So if I'm an immigrant now, I can go online, I can plug in my information and do it. There is a website already called the CRS calculator. You and we could do it as well. You go in, you put in all your education, your language skills and everything else, and it tells you to calculate your score. And then you see, how does my score compare to what the cutoff has been in recent weeks? And I see, if my score is 50 points below what I need, then I could go back into the system and say, okay, well, what if I increase my language score by 3 points? Well, then maybe I should go do some more language training. Or what if I went and got this additional credential? Oh, that would increase my points by 60. Oh, that would get me over the hurdle. And so that's really good. That transparency and predictability allows people to make good decisions in life, to invest in the right new skills. And I think that's all very, very important.
It's important to note that so far in our discussion, we've been talking about the pathway to permanent residency, but the majority of Canada's population growth is in fact in non-permanent residents, notably international students and temporary workers. And according to Mikal, 80 to 90% of these folks are looking to eventually get permanent residency. And the strategy, as it is currently structured, makes the NPR pathway a little more enticing and easier than the PR pathways.
The growth in the population, the exceptional growth in the population we're seeing, we know is overwhelmingly in the non-permanent resident population. And so I'm hearing a lot of people say, well, like this isn't a problem with the government's ambitious targets for permanent immigration. This is some other issue entirely. It has nothing to do with that, and sort of treating these two programs as being independent of each other. I think that's a big problem. I think it misses kind of a key point that they're not independent. And the reason they're not independent, and increasingly over time not independent, is that we have something called two-step immigration. That when migrants are making a decision of whether or not to come to Canada on a temporary permit, whether it's a work permit or study permit, very often, and the best estimates I've seen is, among students, it's 80-90% of these individuals are hoping to make a transition to PR status.
Wow.
So the reason why they're connected then is, of course, that if you change the rules in a way that changes the probabilities of any given individual making that transition from a temporary permit to a permanent status, if you change that probability and people are made aware of that, that's going to change their demand for a temporary permit. If you say it's now easier to make that transition for me, well, then now my value of that permit goes up. And if I have a value for permanent residency and I know the way to get permanent residency is through a temporary permit, now I value that temporary permit more. So there's like the way an economist would think about it is there's actually like a willingness to pay for permanent resident status and then in turn temporary status. And so how does that willingness to pay, is it captured? Well, historically it hasn't been. Canada has been reluctant to charge money for visas for people, but in effect, that's what we're now doing. We're monetizing this incredible willingness to pay by charging people really high tuition. That's a huge part of why people are willing to pay these exorbitant tuition fees, is that they want that temporary permit to make a transition of PR status. And the same with working like in crappy temporary foreign worker jobs, is that the hope is this is just a temporary thing and I'm willing to do it because there's a chance it will get me PR status. So the point is that as you change the rules of the game and you make it easier and less predictable about who gets to make that transition, now people say, well, I'm going to try my luck here. And I think that has led to a massive increase in the appetite for temporary status in Canada. I think it in huge part is driven by kind of just the supply of people that want to make this transition. And so I think that the point is that the increases in the levels and the kind of dismantling of that point system we've been talking about, the comprehensive ranking system, which has largely been dismantled, I would hypothesize is in an important way responsible for the growth in the non-permanent resident population.
And as we've talked about, NPRs, or non-permanent residents, are driving the majority of Canada's population growth. And because our capital stock is not increasing at the rate of population growth, Canada's ability to absorb these newcomers is under strain at the moment, and that has been hurting public support for immigration. Currently, the cost of housing is the primary reason people are concerned with the pace of Canada's immigration growth.
You're right. The polling data that is continuous and is always being done asking Canadians about immigration has pointed to some shift in public opinion on immigration levels. And I think to some extent, those numbers can be kind of self-perpetuating or self-reinforcing. When people hear that other Canadians are maybe questioning the immigration levels more, it kind of tells them that maybe it's okay for them to question them as well. So I think they potentially can build on each other. And in some ways that can be dangerous. I mean, if the kind of the sentiments and views become radical, that's a concern. So that's not necessarily a good thing. But it does beg the question, of course, what began this kind of shift, right? There's got to be something that led to that. I follow this pretty closely. It seems pretty clear to me that it has to do with the housing market. I don't think the kind of the challenges we're facing are exclusive to the housing market, but the housing markets are exceptional. One is that, like housing is a necessity. We all need somewhere to live. So it's kind of like if every one of us has to participate in this market, you can't avoid it. And so that means, of course, we all pay a lot of attention to it too, because it's a big part of our household budget shares, all of us. And for lower income families, it's a much bigger part of their household budget shares. And so when you get big changes in prices in this market that's so important to us, then you notice it. It's extremely transparent. Everybody notices it. And also because the pricing information, like it's a competitive market where this housing is bought and sold in markets where we see the prices. There are websites, the MLS websites, where we get all the information. When our neighbors are selling their houses, we hear like, oh my God, John down the street just sold his house for 5 times what I paid for mine a few years ago, So all of that, I think the housing market really is exceptional in a lot of ways. And I think that's where people are seeing these effects and feeling them the most.
So where do we go from here? How do we protect Canada's long-standing reputation as pro-immigration and ensure that there is a system that not only works for Canada, but for newcomers as well? Mikal says, go back to the basics.
Canada and our immigration system for decades was, at least, economic class immigration, the point system, was the model of the world. I mean, people look to Canada as this is how you do immigration right. And the way that point was most often justified was not actually in the outcomes of the immigrants. It was in the public support.
Right, yeah.
There was for decades a broad consensus that immigration is good for the economy, it's good for the country. That Canada stood out. People have talked about immigration as Canada's secret sauce. I mean, we really were the exception. So if you want a model of how to do immigration, I don't think we really need to look to other countries. I think we just need to look to how we've done it. And the reality is that the reason why immigration are in the headlines now, and it's become a bit of an explosive issue, is because we moved away from a system that was working for a long time. I mean, it really is that. We've sort of undone the system. So at the largest level, what we moved away from is what you were talking about earlier, Britt, is we had a system that prioritized human capital selection, right? So you're bringing in higher skilled immigrants. That tends to raise average living standards. If anything reduces inequality, it doesn't increase inequality because you're putting anything downward pressure on wages at the top end of the distribution. You're not putting downward pressure on wages at the bottom end of the distribution, right? So there's, you're not kind of leading to a lot more anxiety in the population about rising inequality. People at the bottom end of the distribution don't feel like immigrants are competing with them because they look around at immigrants and those are the professors and the doctors and the scientists. And they're like, oh my God, why would we not admit more of these people? These people are making my country better and stronger. So that's the beauty of the system. And so I think that explains in large part the public support. So why have we moved away? Well, we've moved away from that human capital model towards an obsession with labor shortages and plugging holes in lower skilled labor markets. I mean, the government's been very deliberate. I'll tell you one other thing that I don't think I've talked about at all, but I've been thinking about in recent days is I think there was this narrative before 2015 that grew that, we heard about doctors driving taxis, about all these credential recognition problems, and that immigrants come with these high skills and they aren't able to utilize those skills in Canada. There's no question that exists. Let's be clear. In 2015, we introduced an express entry system. If you look at the data on the earnings of immigrants that are admitted through that program, the principal applicants, improvement begins a bit before that because there were lots of changes through the early 2000s. We introduced pre-migration language testing, mandatory language testing. There were a lot of program changes, but express entry through 2015 to 2020, there's been a dramatic improvement in the earnings of new immigrants to Canada to the point that, have higher earnings than the Canadian average. On average,
among economic primary applicants?
Among the economic principal applicants, and substantially higher in the most recent cohorts, right? And so that's consistent with this kind of CRS system being able to cream skim the talent. It was working. There probably were doctors that were driving taxis, but that is not the experience of international students graduating from the University of Toronto, from McGill, from UBC, from University of Waterloo. These international students are doing exceptionally well. That narrative became hyperbolic. That's not what was happening. And so what we did then in 2020, when things were really improving and we seemed to have sort of got it right, Then we dismantle the whole thing to try and plug holes in lower skill labor markets. And that's where my frustration has come in, and why I've been I've never been critical about a government my entire career, ever, in the way I have with this particular government and their immigration policy. I think it's really disappointing how it's been dismantled.
So what's next for immigration policy? Perhaps as the pressure in the housing market eases just enough, so too might the focus on immigration numbers, so we can instead work on crafting a better strategy. One thing I heard recently that got me thinking about it is somebody said something about, we never care about water management strategies and programs unless we're in a drought. And I'm just wondering if that's going to be the case with immigration, as pressure on the housing market maybe eases just enough to kind of take it out in the headlines. We just kind of forget about, the issues.
That's what I'm hoping for. That's exactly what I'm hoping for, is that it is not the headline in the newspapers once a week. It wasn't for decades in Canada. It really wasn't. It was just something on chugging along in the background. That's what you want this to be. So I hope we get back to that. And I think a big part of what's needed to do that, even these student caps, which has been the big headline this week and last week. I'm not in general a fan of these kinds of quantity caps. I don't think generally it's even the ministers acknowledge this is a blunt instrument. I think it doesn't necessarily achieve what we want. I think there's simpler ways to do it. As I proposed to this morning on a tweet I sent out, I think if you went back to having a single pathway to PR status, which is the express entry system with a comprehensive ranking score, you just say that this is the only pathway to economic class immigration. That's transparent. And then you also say to international students, if you're coming here to study, while you're doing your studies, not in the summer, not on holidays, but during your term, you can't work off campus. You can do RART work on campus, but other than that, focus on your studies. I don't think there would be need for caps if you did those two things. I think that would have enough of an effect on the demand for these study permits. The kinds of migrants who are using the study permits as a way to access the labor markets and jobs in Canada, not to do human capital investments, those people will disincentivize to come to Canada to begin with. So I don't think you need cap. I'd prefer if they did it that way.
Immigration policy isn't inherently prosperity driven, but it can be. Done well, immigration can meet labor market needs, it can support new immigrants in their chosen field, it can narrow disparities in the economic and social outcomes, and ultimately, it can boost productivity and economic growth. It's a net benefit for Canada and for newcomers.
Focusing on numbers alone is certainly going to help Canada bake a bigger pie, but to ensure that everyone gets a bigger slice, we need a better strategy. One that anchors newcomer success, is responsive to labor market needs, and is dynamic to changing contexts. We've done this before, and we can do it again.
Well, thank you for tuning into another episode of the Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta. We have been your co-hosts, Brittany Brander
and Alicia Planinchich.
And a special thanks to our guest today, Dr. Mikal Skuterud.
To learn more about the Business Council of Alberta's work on Canada's immigration system, and to follow along as we continue to explore what a prosperity-driven immigration strategy looks like, head on over to our website, businesscouncilab.com, or on social at Business Council AB on X, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube.
And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.